Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This being my first time rising to give a speech of this length, I wanted to pause to give some thanks. First of all, to my neighbours across Kitchener Centre for placing your trust in me to be our community's voice in this place. Thank you. As well to the hundreds of people who joined to knock on doors and make phone calls, in particular a core group, Jackie, Devin, Roz, Joanna, Janet, Zoe, Scott, Wayne, Noah, Greg, Brendan, and Jenna. As well, a special thanks to Mats for all your work over the last 3 years leading up to this point, and of course to Asha, who managed both campaigns. I would not be here without you. A final thanks to both my parents, my mom and my dad, and my brothers, Brad and Rob, and my sister, Emily. You've been there alongside every step of the way, including knocking on doors and making calls, all of which has led me to my having the privilege to speak in moments like these in this place on our community's priorities. Which brings me to Bill C-5. I'd like to start with what I appreciate about this legislation, and that is the stated goal of addressing systemic racism in Canada's criminal justice system. By targeting mandatory minimum penalties, I appreciate that the government is seeking to address the fact that in 2020, despite representing 5% of the Canadian adult population, Indigenous adults accounted for 30% of federally incarcerated inmates, and that the proportion of Indigenous offenders admitted with an offence punishable by a mandatory minimum penalty has almost doubled between 2007 and 8 and 2016-17, from 14 to 26%. And finally, that in 2018-19, Black inmates represented 7% of the federal offender population, but only 3% of the Canadian population. By removing the mandatory minimum penalties included in this bill, I appreciate the government's intent to address these injustices. That being said, we need to be honest with ourselves. Mandatory minimum penalties do not deter crime, and all mandatory minimum penalties contribute to systemic racism. And yet, Bill C-5 as currently proposed, only targets less than 1 in 5 of all mandatory minimum penalties in full. That's just 13 out of 73. Less than 1/3 in full or in part, 20 out of 73, and only 10 of the 28 that courts have already found unconstitutional. In this way, it seems reasonable to assess this bill as one of half measures. Now, I'm only been in this place for just over 3 weeks, and often I'm already hearing the word reconciliation used. On this topic, I'd like to read Call to Action 32 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It says, "We call upon the federal government to amend the criminal code to allow trial judges, upon giving reasons, to depart from mandatory minimum sentences and restrictions on the use of conditional sentences." Note, particularly for the members in this place who purport to support every single one of the calls to action, including, I assume, Call to Action 32, this does not say 1 in 5. I'd also like to read Call to Justice 5.14 of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which reads, "We call upon federal, provincial, and territorial governments to thoroughly evaluate the impact of mandatory minimum sentences as it relates to the sentencing and over-incarceration of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people, and to take appropriate action to address their over-incarceration." Note for those members who I've heard are concerned about crime, including the most recent speaker in this House, to be clear, removing mandatory minimum penalties is really about placing our trust where it should be, in the judiciary. In place of mandatory minimum penalties, sentencing judges would still be required to impose a sentence that's proportionate to the degree of responsibility of the offender and the seriousness of the offense, taking into account all aggravating and mitigating factors. This includes risk to public safety. It also includes the individual and all relevant circumstances of the case in front of them, including acknowledging and redressing the realities of colonialism and systemic racism in the lives of Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, and other racialized groups. A final point I'd like to make is that this bill, of course, misses a significant opportunity. And that is that even with mandatory minimum penalties removed, people across the country will still be going to jail for simple possession of illicit drugs, and people will continue to die from addiction and from a dangerous supply. We would continue to be applying an outdated understanding of drug use from the 1980s instead of applying the very clear public health advice from experts, including the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police that we have in front of us, and that is to decriminalize illicit drugs, to offer a regulated safe supply, and treat this like the mental health and addictions crisis that we know that it is. So far this year alone, just in my community, we've lost 120 community members to a poisoned drug supply. Since January 2016, across the country, over 25,000 lives have been lost, each one a preventable death. For this reason, I support the calls made by others in this House, encouraging the Minister to move this bill to committee before second reading, so that scope can be expanded to include decriminalization. In closing, I'd like to offer two considerations to the government. The first is to consider expanding the list of mandatory minimums to be repealed by this bill to address their stated intent of addressing systemic racism. And the second is to consider offering the clear evidence that the small fraction of mandatory minimum penalties currently included to be repealed by C5 would, in fact, reduce the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in federal prisons. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to welcome our new colleague from Kitchener Centre to the House and congratulate him on his election. With respect to the bill itself, I want to get a sense from him with respect to conditional sentencing orders, what he thinks the impact of that will be on overall ensuring that we have off-ramps for those who are just getting involved with the criminal justice system, and if we can maybe comment on its potential impact on the overall incarceration of racialized people.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Yes, thank you to the member for the question, to the Parliamentary Secretary, and congratulations to him on his re-election. We heard significant amounts from a previous member on CSOs. I would rather focus the commentary, whether it's now or in committee, on expanding the number of mandatory minimum penalties that should be repealed. And in doing so, that would be the most effective way. We've seen it in the research. It's by repealing the mandatory minimums that we have the best chance of reducing the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous and racialized inmates in incarceration.
The Honourable Member for Brantford Brant.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague, with respect to the offences of possession of a controlled substance under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, where in Section 4 of that Act does it speak to any mandatory minimum penalties? You spoke about automatic jail sentences, so I'd like to know what clarification on that.
Speak through me, please. I didn't say anything, so please, okay. Complete your question. Just to speak through me and not directly at the member.
I'd like the honourable member to inform me where in Section 4 of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Acts it speaks to mandatory minimum penalties.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Yes, to the point, thank you for the question to the Honourable Member. Again, the point I was making is that for all mandatory minimums, when they are repealed, sentencing judges would still be required to impose a sentence proportionate to the degree of responsibility, and that I trust in the judiciary to follow through appropriately.
Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What people know of St. Anne's Residential School is it was where children were tortured in an electric chair. What they know is that the Justice Department suppressed thousands of pages of police evidence. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague, we just had a new report by a justice, a total whitewash, in which he says that the adjudicators who rejected claims of survivors who were tortured in the electric chair, those adjudicators were right because at the time, torturing Indigenous children in an electric chair was considered a form of entertainment by the priests. If we have that view in 2021 of what justice is, the right of the government to suppress evidence when it comes to Indigenous rights, that it's okay, how can we expect that anyone in this system who's Indigenous will ever get justice in Canada?
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you to the honourable member for the question. It's why I am so glad to have honourable members like the honourable member from Nunavut in this place, that the voices of Indigenous peoples are increasingly being heard directly in this place. It's why I included a citation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the National Inquiry, is that I think this place is better served when the voices of Indigenous people directly are being heard and their calls are, as appropriately should be, answered.